Welcome to Thinking Class, Elisabeth. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the show. Yeah, Elisabeth, I stumbled across you, I suppose algorithmically speaking, on LinkedIn and Twitter around about the same time. I guess the internet must have sensed there was some adjacent thoughts going on in my grey matter alongside what it is that you write and speak about so much these days, which is predicting, I suppose, the downfall of globalization as we know it. And you write very straightforwardly, intelligently, entertainingly about it and its prospects. And I particularly was drawn to you because you are someone who chronicles practical evidence of what it is that you're saying we're seeing, instead of just engaging in abstract policy discussions. So I guess before we dive into the meat of what it is that you focus on, globalization is a term that is used a lot, and I think people have a sense for what it is. Perhaps we should start with defining it in its entirety. So how would you define globalization, Elisabeth?
Well, that's a good idea. And let me just say one thing first, which is that it's interesting how Donald Trump has weaponized the whole concept of globalization and decided to call it globalism, to essentially suggest that it's some sort of ideology like communism. But globalization really is globe-spanning trade between countries, which is why the round that we have seen since the 80s that accelerated, especially in the early 90s, and then peaked about 1.5 decades ago. That's the most globalization we have ever had. We have had other rounds in world history of countries trading a lot amongst themselves. And we saw, for example, in the Roman Empire, various regions of the Roman Empire traded a lot among themselves, but that was not the whole world. What we got in the late 80s and early 90s and since was really most of the parts of the world trading together and doing so very beneficially for everybody, or so it seemed at the time.
Okay, well, that's a useful starting point. So as I alluded to in the intro, you write a lot about how globalization has started to hit the buffers, as it were. So let's look at some of the evidence that there is a move away from it, culturally, politically, economically.
The reason I started thinking that something fundamental was changing was when I started hearing from business people that Russia is just not as welcoming as it used to be. China is not as welcoming as it used to be. Something fundamental is shifting. And that's when I think you really have to pay attention, because business people are the practitioners of globalization, right? I mean, analysts can sit in their studies or even maybe in their living rooms and have opinions about globalization, but it's the business people who are out there making it happen. And if they are saying something fundamental is shifting, it's just not the way it used to be, then you should pay attention. And so I started paying attention, paying closer attention, and indeed very close attention. And it became obvious to me that we were seeing several things happen at the same time. China and Russia were becoming less hospitable. And this is, we should remember, during a period, so we are talking about a few years ago, when Xi Jinping had taken over, when he was keen to assert his government's power over the rest of society. And that included the private sector. So if you are the Chinese government, then you don't want the private sector to become so successful that it becomes a threat to you. And that's what we were beginning to see evidence of. And in Russia, of course, we saw essentially the Russian government becoming less predictable, less sane. And I remember vividly, I had a conversation with somebody who then who turned out to be a very wise prophet, although he is a businessman, but on this he was prophetic. And he said, I will my company will not be making any more strategic investments in Russia. It's just too unpredictable. And with the sort of longer term that you need for investments, who knows what will happen 10 years from now? It's just not good business to make those sort of investments when you can't know what will happen from one day to the next. And then the other thing that was emerging around the same time was that Western companies' IP loss really became a big issue in the Western business community. And they had tolerated it for years, losing IP to Chinese competitors. But by the middle of the last decade, Chinese companies have become so successful and so powerful, not least thanks to the IP that they had acquired legally or illegally from Western competitors, that they were all of a sudden very close competitors. They were not just some sort of puny companies to whom you could afford to lose IP. And then, perhaps most importantly, two things: Western citizens beginning to voice their unhappiness with globalization, most prominently by electing Donald Trump. But we also saw some of it in the Brexit vote. And it was not specifically about globalization, but it was this unhappiness with faraway elites that decide about our lives. And so that was a sort of a convenient vote for people to cast, even though globalization was not on the ballot paper. And then one more thing, which is the geopolitical standoff that began to emerge between the West on one hand and Russia and China on the other hand. And so with all those developments going on at the same time, those forces against globalization, it was clear that globalization was going to be in trouble.
I find it very interesting that there's so much talk about supply chain resilience now. If you spend any time looking at, the yellow papers of the Financial Times, or if you spend any time in the corporate world, and it seems to me that it's a little bit of a euphemism. And sometimes I can't tell what it stands for. Sometimes I can't tell whether it stands for, we want to keep globalization going, but let's just figure out where else to manufacture all of these thousands of parts for our various electrical items. That isn't China and Russia, or let's figure out where to import those from. Or whether it's, is there going to be a renaissance in Western domestic industry, for example? I mean, Lord knows Britain needs that out of the Western nations. What do you think about that? What do you think it means? What do you think all this focus on supply chain resilience is about? Is it about keeping the show on the road as it has always been, or is it about let's start bringing things closer to home?
It is true that we are seeing a lot of supply chain talk, and even people who have nothing to do with supply chains know that there is a problem with supply chains. And they know that because it's being discussed everywhere. And one reason it's being discussed everywhere is that COVID struck and brought home very vividly to everybody, from businesses to ordinary citizens, that we are incredibly closely connected with China. We should remember that it's because we are that closely connected that the virus itself traveled from China first to Italy and then to other countries. If we hadn't been that closely connected, it wouldn't have spread that quickly. But the other thing that happened was that Chinese authorities were not transparent with the rest of the world about the fact that the virus was spreading. And it doesn't matter where it originated. The fact is that it started spreading, and they denied they were spreading. And as a result, it continued to spread and then spread to the rest of the world. So that's how many people, politicians and ordinary citizens, lost faith in the Chinese leadership. But when it comes to supply chain and supply chain resilience, COVID was also a very vivid reminder of how dependent we are on China, especially, but in other countries as well, because during COVID, all of a sudden became much more difficult to import from other countries. And companies that had major manufacturing and supply chains in China all of a sudden found themselves stranded, and I write about this in the book. They were stranded because there were constant lockdowns in China. China had a zero COVID policy after a while when they came around to acknowledging that they had a COVID problem. So that meant that factories could close just like that. And if you're a Western company or any sort of company, and your supplier may have to suspend operations at any moment, what does that do to your faith in your supply chain? You start saying, well, maybe I should get additional suppliers that will be more expensive, but then I will have a backup. Maybe I should just move away from Chinese suppliers altogether. That is also very difficult. That is very difficult because China is the factory of the world. But those sort of thoughts started being entertained in corporate headquarters, and not just entertained but acted upon. And I think it's interesting when analysts and general commentators talk about, we need to shore up our supply chains. Companies are working very hard at that, and it's just extremely hard to do. And it is really like selling your house, but it's 1,000 times more complicated. You have to find an alternative. You have to completely shift around what it is you need to have where, and you have to do it without any disruption to your customers. It's so complicated. But that action is taking place precisely because companies are concerned that their supply chains may be disrupted by Mother Nature or by political actions in a country like China.
I can't remember which platform it was that you commented, Elisabeth, but you had mentioned there were people relatively high ranking within business and that sometimes disagree with you that globalization is ailing. It sounds to me, and it seems to me in your book, that there's lots of evidence that it is. So why is it that people disagree with you when you say that globalization may well be coming to a halt?
I think the people who disagree with me are a few academics, and they measure trade flows and they say, well, look, the trade flows this year were great, and based on that, globalization is not in trouble. But of course, trade flows measure what has been, whereas what I'm saying is that people have lost faith in globalization. So we'll see less trade between certain countries, and also if you measure trade flows collectively around the world, I don't think they will decline because we'll trade more with countries that we are friends with, or at least are not on hostile terms with. So we won't see trade flows plummet simply because we don't trade as much with Russia and China anymore. What my point is that it's just not globalization anymore. If you don't have the key parts of the world involved, it's not globalization. And so I think that's the point that these academics are missing. First of all, they measure what has been, when, restructuring your supply chains is such a lengthy undertaking that it will take some time before companies can shift operations, partially shift operations out of China towards other countries. And that's what we may start seeing less trade with China, but it will be slow, it will be gradual. But what matters is that people have lost faith in globalization.
Okay. Well, I don't think I could disagree with that, judging by the mood music that you see, whether it's in polling data or whether it's within all of the evidence that you suggest, and you drop breadcrumbs throughout your Twitter feed saying, here's another example of it coming to an end in the way that we knew it. You have suggested that we're saying goodbye to globalization and that it might be a good thing that we are. Why is that?
Globalization, the way it was thought out, it was never really an ideology. It was just an opportunity that came along in the late 80s and especially in the early 90s, when we had lots of countries all saying at the same time, we want to introduce market economy. First came China, which did market economy its way, first through a few experimental areas, and then more widely. But it was market economy with Chinese characteristics, and of course, after that came the countries behind the Iron Curtain. But because all of that happened at the same time, and in addition to that, we also saw countries in Latin America open up. They had been protectionist, but they opened up. So all of a sudden, we sort of got globalization served on a platter, and we said, "Oh, that is fantastic." And what was your question?
I was asking why it might be a good thing that we're getting less globalization, or that it's on its way out.
And everybody seemed to want the same thing, which was market economy, trade with each other, be friends. That was the sound of the 90s. But at least as far as Western countries are concerned, we were naive in thinking that it was some sort of new era, and we thought that Russia and China wanted to become like us simply because they wanted market economies. No, they just wanted, as it has turned out, they just wanted higher living standards for their own citizens. It had nothing to do with them wanting to become like us, or at least with their leaders wanting their countries to become like us. But that took us a very long time to figure out. In fact, it has taken us until basically now to figure out. So we built globalization on this idea that everybody wants the same thing, and we are there. Essentially, we are all good-willing, well-meaning nations who all have a stake in this and who all want to make this work. And the sort of pinnacle of that was when China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. And as a member there, you have to follow certain rules. And we were convinced that China would follow those rules. And then it emerged that China wasn't going to be particularly faithful to those rules, but there was nothing we could do about it. So globalization this round has been based on I think, overly optimistic assessments of our fellow countries. And it also has included a few key areas, most crucially climate change. I mean, climate change was just not a big issue in the 80s and early 90s, and now it is an existential issue. So it is a good thing that globalization is retreating, because it has this round had many flaws. Now we get to rethink what we think globalization should look like, and I think we come up with a new version that is less intense, less all-encompassing, but more realistic, and also includes climate change. And who knows what other existential issues may emerge in the next few years. But definitely climate change will have to be baked into the globalized economy when it reemerges as a globalized economy.
It would be good to return to what you think, and I know you referred to it as this in a recent conversation with some senior business leaders, what globalization 2.0 might look like. But let's stick to that environmental point for a moment. It's tangential. It's not exactly the same as climate change, but you posted an article in Foreign Policy recently where you had shown through examples of conflict, particularly in the Red Sea. The Houthis, I think, had downed a ship. I can't remember whose ship it was, and it had 21,000 metric tons of ammonium phosphate sulfate fertilizer on board, which is just going to cause unbelievable environmental damage. Another example of why companies, nations are trying to find new trade routes in which to not have to go through this and keep it all going. And whilst we're on that, I think it's probably worthwhile talking a little bit about that acronym many people have become familiar with, ESG, for good or for ill, so environmental, social governance. And I suppose it came on the scene, it was seen as an unalloyed, do-gooding thing. And there's lots of talk about it providing win-win investments, which turned out not to be backed up by the evidence, judging by recent studies. But it does attract those who hope for business to be able to do good through their business activities. And it's since become supported by a vast array of international reporting frameworks to try and bring about any of the goals that have been set by the organizations that are supporting certain aspects of it. And these are typically thought up in cosmopolitan hubs by people like you and I, right? The professional managerial class. And we can have a tendency to, and I say that more in a figure of speech rather than actually you and I, but we have a tendency to think in solutions rather than trade-offs. And let's get into the trade-offs, because you've posted about something specifically to do with military spending and security recently, where you said there are unintended consequences of these technocratic programs like ESG. What were those examples about military spending and activity that have been impacted by ESG?
Yes, so under ESG rules, defense spending, or rather lending to defense companies became undesirable because defense companies were seen as doing ill rather than doing good. So that meant that first of all, lenders didn't want to lend the money, and every company needs additional financial infusions every now and then for all kinds of reasons. But it became much harder for defense companies to lend money or to get financing because they were seen as doing harm rather than good. And so their financing became more expensive. And you can say, well, defense companies, they make products that kill people. Of course, that is doing harm rather than doing good. But now, with the world shifting, we have realized that, we need defense companies and we need their products if we are to keep our countries safe. And yet we have this long legacy of ESG making it difficult for them to get financing. And as a result, difficult for them to expand, which is precisely what we need them to do now. Now, some of this, some ESG practitioners and companies that use ESG rules and guidelines are beginning to change their ways, but slowly. And we need this investment in defense manufacturing now. If we are to get the defense equipment we need to send to Ukraine and to have in our countries. So it definitely is a case of unintended consequences. But it was also, I think, the case that the people who thought up and executed ESG never really understood national security.
No, I dare say that what drives people who get involved in ESG thinking about military conflict is probably not in their top priorities, and I suppose that goes back to that tendency for optimism, which obscures a whole bunch of important things actually, and leads you to commit a few planning fallacies where you just think things will turn out okay because you've got good intentions, and I'm simplifying things heavily here, but that is a great example of thinking you can manage things by metrics and targets, and hey, like, how could this possibly have some kind of a detrimental impact on our national security by us just trying to do good? And so it has, and I guess there's a theme arising from some of your other responses here, which is linked to what you're talking about with China's accession to the World Trade Organization and relations with it and Russia. And those of us who are from these liberal countries, which have come from a very specific constitution, but right, it's from a very long culture, first Christian before then becoming secular, but still bathed in it for a couple of thousand years, and thus a very different way of seeing the world and approaching one another than other nations and regions. And I think we can be quite prone to being unscrupulously optimistic and obscuring things from our view that doesn't quite fit the narrative.
Yes, and that has led many Western leaders and analysts and others to think and say that, Putin would never do this, Putin would never do that. Both because the tendency is to think, to see others, to judge to assess their thinking as as if they think like we do. Well, they may think in a completely different way. They may have completely different priorities. So you can't, so if you engage in mirror imaging and say, well, invading Ukraine would be such a terrible idea because it would cause ABC harm to Russia. Therefore, it's not going to happen. Well, Putin may not be interested in those reasons. He may invading Ukraine may be his number one priority, and mirror imaging, I think, leads us down the wrong path.
Absolutely. A personal anecdote. About 7 years ago, I went to anti-corruption week-long set of seminars, and in one of our little groups, there was a Russian woman who lived in Paris, and I was still pretty wet behind the ears at that point, to use an English phrase, and we were talking about how to deal with elements of corruption, and I was only bringing it from my British perspective. And she said, well, that's just not going to work in Russia. And I remember responding in this, well, of course it would, it's really simple. It's X, Y, Z. And she's like,
yeah.
No, you just don't understand Russia.
Yeah.
You're thinking at it from a totally different angle. Earlier, you spoke about the how we overestimated our ability to get China to see things like us when they acceded to the World Trade Organization. And I wonder, since then, whether we've been influenced, we in the West have been influenced by their ways of doing things and governing. And to give you an example of that, I suppose there are, amongst the commentariat, you'd see comment on the rise of digital mass surveillance, for example, or that within our central banks, there's a tendency towards things like central bank digital currencies, which are similar to social credit scoring that goes on over in China. Do you think there has been an influence the other way? Have we become a little bit more like their modes of governance?
I don't think we've become like them, but there has emerged in the popular, the general discourse among people and among some professional commentators, this idea that, authoritarian countries do everything better and it's just hopeless being a liberal democracy and we should be a bit more like them. Because we see that, whenever something happens in China, they can just have Xi Jinping say a fiat lux, and then the government machinery kicks into the highest gear and gets it done, and not just the government machinery, but the private sector and indeed civil society. And we say, it's hopeless. We are so disorganized, we are so divided, and we should just be more like them. Well, I think if anybody who proposes we should be like them were to go and live in Russia and China at the moment, I think they would be very pleased to have a Western passport and the knowledge that they could, unless they get arrested, they could get back to their home country whenever they wanted to. Whereas, of course, Russian and Chinese citizens are not in that fortunate position.
Okay, well, I know we are very tight on time, so I'll start bringing this into the end zone, as it were. And I'm going to pick up on a thread from earlier, which was different ways in which we're now accepting that globalization is not quite working. There's the thread we've already covered, which is business leaders realizing things are changing in places that they would source materials from and goods from in Russia and China. But then there was also the sentiment of the wider public outside of policymaking, governance circles and business circles saying, kind of had enough of this model. And so on that note, I'm going to quote something from Dominic Cummings that I just read in an article that was published in the New Yorker recently. And someone who was a London staff writer had written about 14 years of conservative rule and the key figures within that and key things that happened. So this is Dominic Cummings' observation that Britain has failed to confront the full implications of the Brexit vote, and you'll see where I'm going with this with the follow-up question. He said, you can just treat it as like a weird thing, like a witch trial in a medieval village. Now the witch has been burned, and now the community is getting back to normal. Or you can think of it as part of big structural changes in Western politics, society, and the economy. If the establishment thinks you can treat it like a sort of episode of witchcraft mania, then they're just going to walk straight into recurring shocks. So, since the book's launch, Elisabeth, you've been meeting with leaders of large multinationals, presumably people in government as well. Are they preparing for a return to an economically divided world, which is what supporters of Brexit and perhaps Trump, in some respect, would like? They want more domestic-focused policies. And will they start to engage with the sentiments of those outside of the metropolitan class? Or is Globalization 2.0 going to be a rerun of Globalization 1.0, but just with different players?
Well, it depends on who will be in charge. I think the mistake that somebody like Donald Trump makes is to think that everything can be made in America or whatever the country may be. The end of globalization doesn't mean that we should or will stop trading. It just means that we shouldn't and won't trade as much with countries that don't share our values, because that causes enormous risks to businesses, and it's just too perilous to make our societies dependent on countries that don't share our values. But we can still trade with a lot of other countries, and a lot of other countries are essentially benign, are happy to trade with us, don't wish us ill. Obviously, they'll defend our rights if there's a disagreement or something, but that's how countries act. So I think there is, especially in America, which is obviously such a large country population-wise, and not to mention economy-wise, there is this this tempting idea that, we should just make everything at home. And the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that was passed a couple of years ago, was essentially a step in that direction. It incentivizes companies to invest in green technology in America. So what you get is a win-win-win. You get companies returning, jobs returning from China to America. You get the green transition, and you get qualified manufacturing jobs at home in America. So you reduce the dependence on China, you get the green transition, and you get new jobs. But America somehow forgot America's closest friends in the process of passing the Inflation Reduction Act. And it wasn't, I'm not saying that it was Trump's doing. This is obviously a congressional bill, and by the way, negotiated with the White House under Joe Biden. But there is this tendency, especially under Trump, but maybe a bit under Biden as well, to think, America should just make it as much as possible at home. And that's not what we should hope for America or any other Western country. We should hope for more trade among countries that follow the rules, that share a basic set of values. They don't have to be liberal democracies, all of them, but share a commitment to maintaining some sort of global order. And I think with that, we can increase trade with other countries. It's just the countries that weaponize global trade. It's too dangerous to hinge our future on them.
Agreed. I will, from a purely British perspective, maintain hope that we do reorient ourselves a little bit, so we're not just so focused on a service-based economy, because it is so out of whack here. And as someone from the north of England, I know that we probably do export far too much to other countries with regards to our manufacturing capabilities. So we could do with some more of that back. And
imagine what creation of high-skilled manufacturing jobs could do for the north of England, for the Midlands. There are people who would be who are there and willing to learn the skills are needed, because the jobs that may return are not like the jobs that left in this most recent round of globalization. But the people are there and are willing and able to learn these new skills. And what's not to like, as long as it as it doesn't lead to an idea of protectionism or let's do everything at home. But the Midlands could play, and the North of England could play an incredibly positive role within trade among the West and its partners. And one day maybe Russia and China will return to the fold.
Well, it will be written. Elisabeth, thanks so much for joining me. Before I let you go, you're active on social media. You've got various publications. Where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Elisabeth Braw, that's Elisabeth with an S, and they can find me on LinkedIn. And most especially, they can find me on Foreign Policy, which is foreignpolicy.com, and they will find all my pieces there, as well as on Political Europe's website and in other publications.
Excellent. And I presume they can buy your recent book, Goodbye Globalization, from all good bookshops and Amazon.
All good bookshops and Amazon. All right, John.
Great. Okay. Well, Elisabeth, thanks so much for joining me on the show, and I look forward to keeping up with what you're doing.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for joining me in Thinking Class today. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.